Hello and welcome to the 160th of a second photography podcast. This is our Christmas gift edition. So sit back and have a think about what gifts you would like as a photographer and what gifts you could buy for a photographer. So I personally think that photographers are very difficult to buy gifts for. Photography is an expensive hobby. You tend to amass quite a lot of kit, gear and equipment, and you tend to get things that are going to last. So if you pick the example of a tripod, you're going to pick a decent tripod. It's going to have a good ball head. And what that means is someone who's buying you a gift, if they were to buy you a tripod, it would either have to be a very expensive tripod or it wouldn't be as good as the one you've got. So they're unlikely to buy you a tripod. They also might not have the technical photography knowledge and know what to buy you. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about gifts for photographers, give some suggestions of what maybe a photographer might like. And if your partner is a photographer or you're buying for a photographer, this might be particularly useful. If you're a photographer, maybe you can pass these tips on to someone who's buying you a gift, or maybe it will give you an idea of something you might want to buy yourself. So we all have our niches in photography, and maybe getting out of our niches is a good idea. So some of the gifts I'm going to suggest now are things that just give a different alternative. Now, I'm starting at the more expensive end. So at the start of this podcast, we're going to be talking about more expensive gifts, and at the end, less expensive gifts. So we all photograph on land. The first thing is to photograph from the air. So DJI have just launched the Mavic Mini 2. So maybe consider a drone. I have the Mavic Mini and I think it's great. And some of the older drones are just as good. I know the Mavic Mini 2 can shoot in RAW and do 4K, whereas the original Mavic Mini can't, but I'm still really happy with the Mavic Mini and it's a very good drone. So do consider a drone and do consider getting off the ground and taking pictures from the air. The other thing is something like a 360 camera. That's another perspective of photography. So maybe get your photographer a 360 camera. There's a new one out, the Insta360-1X, I think. There's also the Ricoh Theta series. They're very good for photographs. And maybe consider your photographer doing a bit more videography. So maybe something like an action camera, a camera with built-in stabilization, so that they can go out, film things without having to take their big expensive DSLR or mirrorless. Now let's talk about less expensive things. So if your photographer is maybe a bird watcher or does sports or something, they might like binoculars or a spotting scope. That might be quite useful for them. The other things you could get are things like software. Now, in the olden days when we had film, you could always buy a photographer film because they'd always need it as a consumable. There aren't really any consumables anymore. However, if your photographer is using the Adobe Creative Photography plan, they've got to pay for that every year. So maybe you could buy that for them and then they don't have to pay for that every year. We're talking about £80 to £100 for that. But you could also consider getting them software that they don't need to subscribe to. So you could get them some of the Affinity ones, you could get them some of the On ones. What else is there? There's the DxO RAW editor, and maybe if they're starting in videography, you could get them some video editing software, or you could get something like Portrait Pro if they are a portrait photographer. Now, Portrait Pro, essentially, it's a bit like Luminar, and it uses AI and it basically retouches your photos for you with a few clicks rather than going through all the airbrushing techniques you might use in Photoshop. And of course, there is Luminar AI, but I can't recommend that because I haven't tried it myself. Everything I'm recommending I have some experience with, but Luminar AI has just come out, so I can't recommend that. Now, I did use the first Luminar and I absolutely hated it and it didn't work and it was fiddly. So Luminar AI, it may be good, but it may not be good. I don't know. So there are other things as well you can get at the lower end of the price bracket. A graphics tablet is very good for someone who does photo editing and photo retouching. It's much easier to use than your mouse. Other gifts can be things like reflectors. Now, I recommend the Lastelite Halo reflector because that folds up really small and you can change things on it. I've got that. That's a great reflector. LED lights, LED wands are quite good. So they just might be something your photographer doesn't have, and it might be something you can give them that does surprise them. and is not just another tripod. You could also get them some cleaning items, some sensor cleaning, maybe a multi-tool to take out with them to help screw things into tripods and tripod mounts. What about a Lens Baby Omni? Now that is a system where you put things in front of the lens to give sort of these specular highlights and these blurs and other things. You can just use some sellotape and stick things over your lens if you want to, but the Lens Baby Omni is the proper way to do it without causing fuss, damage, mess, etc. What about a bag? Some of the Peak Design bags are really good. I quite like the Peak Design Tech Pouch for putting all your stuff in. I think that's really good. And I've got a few Peak Design bags myself, and they are by far the best bags you can get. Maybe look for alternative items. So if your photographer has a tripod, why not get them a monopod? Why not get them a base plate like the Platypod or something along those lines? So you're giving them the option of not having to take out the huge tripod every time. They could take a monopod, which is lighter. They could take a base plate. They don't always have to take the heavy equipment because you've given them an alternative. And maybe the last thing I would say, or maybe not the last thing, but the last thing I would suggest is, because it's so difficult to buy them something without spending an awful lot of money, pay for them to go somewhere to do photography. Now that's easier said than done at the moment. Let's imagine there was no pandemic. Maybe buy them 2 nights in a bed and breakfast in the Lake District so they can go and do some photography in the Lake District, and you're contributing to that. Maybe if they like city breaks, pay for them or pay for part of an aspect of a city break where they're doing photography. And lastly but not least, every photographer is going to have their favourite images. So why not get a print and a frame of their favourite images? It's going to be more difficult to surprise them with this. However, if they have a favourite image, why not get it printed and give it to them so they can put it up on the wall? It's not been a fantastic Christmas gifts episode, but I hope it has given you maybe some alternatives of what you could get your photographer that maybe you hadn't thought of. Or if you are a photographer, maybe you can use these tips to gently nudge someone who's looking for some inspiration for something to buy you for Christmas. Enjoy Black Friday, enjoy Cyber Monday, and I will catch you next week. Thank you. Goodbye.